Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if brilliant minds in a city of brass and steam unravelled mysteries that hummed with clockwork precision, where logic danced with wonder beneath gaslit skies, and innovation bloomed like copper roses in the fog? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. In the heart of London, where copper pipes sang gentle songs and steam rose like prayers into the amber-lit evening, the year 1907 settled over the city like a warm blanket woven from progress and possibility. The streets hummed with a different kind of energy than they had in decades past. Not the harsh clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone, but the softer whir of clockwork carriages and the melodic hiss of pneumatic message tubes that carried whispers from one corner of the great metropolis to another. The fog that had always been London's faithful companion now carried new scents. The sweet metallic tang of brass polish, the warm oil that kept the great gears turning, and the curious ozone smell that drifted from the electrical workshops, where inventors bent over their benches, crafting tomorrow with their careful, calloused hands. Gas lamps still flickered along the thoroughfares, but they shared their duty now with the soft blue glow of Edison bulbs and the occasional warm amber light of experimental illumination that painted the fog in shades of honey and dreams. It was in this transformed London, this city where tradition waltzed with innovation in perfect measured steps, that our story begins to unfold, slowly, gently, like the opening of a music box that has waited patiently to share its song. At 221B Baker Street, the familiar sitting room breathed with quiet contentment. The fire in the grate crackled with the same warm voice it had always possessed, though now it warmed not just wood and coal, but also the small brass mechanisms that ticked and hummed softly on the mantelpiece, a collection of curious devices that their owner had gathered over months of fascinating encounters. Steam curled lazily from a copper kettle that hung suspended from an ingenious mechanical arm, one that could be adjusted with the gentle pull of a silk cord to pour tea at precisely the right temperature. The wallpaper, a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb and soften the lamplight, bore the gentle shadows of new additions to the room's familiar comfort. Brass pipes ran along the crown moulding, carrying heated air from a central furnace that hummed somewhere deep in the building's heart, and small copper speaking tubes emerged from discreet holes near the windows, their polished surfaces gleaming like miniature trumpets waiting to carry messages to and from the street below. Dr. John Watson sat in his customary chair, though it had been fitted with small mechanical adjustments that could support his leg at precisely the angle his old wound preferred, controlled by a simple lever disguised as part of the chair's wooden arm. His medical bag rested beside him, but it too had evolved, now crafted from supple leather reinforced with brass corners, and containing not just his traditional instruments, but also several curious devices that clicked and whirred softly, innovations he had acquired from the medical workshops that had begun to spring up throughout the city like mechanical flowers. The good doctor's eyes moved across the pages of the Times, though even this familiar routine had taken on new dimensions. The newspaper itself was delivered not by a boy with ink-stained fingers, but by a small mechanical courier that rolled on brass wheels and chimed a gentle melody when it arrived each morning. The articles within spoke of wonders that would have seemed like fairy tales just a decade before. Airships that carried passengers above the clouds, automatons that could perform simple tasks with human-like grace, and workshops where inventors laboured to bridge the gap between imagination and reality. Across from Watson, in the chair that had moulded itself to his lean frame through years of contemplation, sat Sherlock Holmes. But even the great detective had not remained untouched by the gentle revolution that was transforming their world. His pipe, that constant companion of his thinking hours, now drew its tobacco from a small mechanical dispenser that could measure exact quantities with the precision of a pharmacist's scale. His famous magnifying glass had been enhanced with additional lenses that could be rotated into position with the turn of a brass wheel, each one ground to reveal different aspects of the evidence he studied with such passionate intensity The detective's sharp features were softened by the warm light that filtered through lampshades of amber glass, and his grey eyes held that particular quality of alertness that Watson had learned to recognise. The look of a mind that sensed the approach of an interesting puzzle, like a cat that had caught the first whisper of a mouse stirring in the walls. The evening settled around them with the weight of velvet, punctuated by the gentle sounds of their mechanically enhanced world, the soft tick of clockwork devices, the distant hiss of steam, and the occasional melodic chime of a message tube receiving correspondence from the network that now connected every building in their neighbourhood, like the nervous system of some vast, benevolent creature. It was into this atmosphere of warm anticipation that the first thread of their mystery chose to weave itself. The sound came first as a gentle rapping at their door, not the sharp knock of urgency, but the measured tap of someone who understood that important matters could be discussed without haste. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up the stairs, carrying with it the slight mechanical echo that had become part of her speech since she'd installed the brass-speaking trumpet that allowed her to communicate with her tenants without climbing the 17 steps that had begun to trouble her aging knees. "Mr. Holmes?" Her voice carried the warm concern that had become as much a part of Baker Street as the familiar creak of the floorboards. "There's a gentleman here to see you. Says it's about some missing persons, and he's got the look of a man who hasn't slept properly in days." Holmes set down his evening paper, the pages rustling with the soft whisper of quality stock, and exchanged a glance with Watson that spoke volumes without requiring words. In the gaslit quiet of their sitting room, both men could sense that this would not be an ordinary case of a missing spouse or a runaway child. There was something in Mrs. Hudson's tone, a quality of unease that suggested their visitor carried with him the weight of a mystery that would require all of their combined skills to unravel. "Please show him up, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called, his voice carrying easily down the speaking tube that connected their sitting room to the front door. "And perhaps you might bring tea. Something tells me we'll be here for quite some time." The footsteps that ascended the stairs were measured but heavy, the tread of a man who carried more than just his physical weight. When their visitor appeared in the doorway, both Holmes and Watson could see immediately that Mrs. Hudson's assessment had been entirely accurate. The man who stood before them was perhaps 50 years of age, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. But his clothes were wrinkled as if he had slept in them, and his eyes held the hollow quality that comes from too many sleepless nights spent wrestling with problems that have no obvious solutions. He was dressed in the fashion of a successful tradesman, or perhaps a workshop owner. His coat was well tailored but practical, made from wool that could withstand the rigours of a working life, and his hands bore the telltale stains and small scars that spoke of someone who worked with metals and precision instruments. A small brass pin on his lapel caught the lamplight, revealing itself to be an intricate gear surrounded by a circle of tiny tools, the mark of the London Artificers Guild. "Mr. Holmes," the man began, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spoken too many words of worry over too many days. "My name is Edmund Hartwell. I'm the master artificer at Hartwell's Clockwork Emporium in Whitechapel. I've come to you because I believe my apprentices are being stolen." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own, a comfortable piece upholstered in green leather that had been fitted with the same mechanical adjustments as Watson's. "Please sit, Mr. Hartwell. Watson, would you mind closing the curtains? I suspect our guest's story will require our complete attention." As Watson moved to draw the heavy burgundy drapes across the windows, shutting out the gentle glow of the street lamps and the occasional flash of an airship's navigation lights passing overhead, Holmes leaned forward with the particular intensity brought to the opening moments of a new case. The fire crackled in the grate, sending warm shadows dancing across the walls, and the room seemed to draw itself inward, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety where difficult truths could be spoken without fear. Hartwell settled into the offered chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had been pushed beyond its normal limits by stress and sleepless nights. His hands, Watson noted with his physician's eye, trembled slightly, not from age or illness, but from the fine nervous tension that comes from wrestling with a problem that seems to have no rational solution. "It began 3 weeks ago," Hartwell said, his voice finding strength as he settled into the familiar rhythm of explanation. "My youngest apprentice, a boy named Thomas Whitmore, simply disappeared from the workshop. One moment he was there, adjusting the mainspring of a particularly complex chronometer, and the next, gone. No word, no explanation, nothing. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway with a tea service that gleamed with brass fittings and small mechanical improvements. The teapot itself was a marvel of practical engineering, with a spout that could be adjusted to pour at different rates, and a handle that remained cool no matter how hot the contents became. She set the service on the small table between the chairs, her movements quick and efficient, then withdrew with the understanding discretion that had made her an invaluable part of their household for so many years. Holmes poured the tea with movements that were both precise and graceful, the amber liquid steaming gently in cups that had been warmed by small brass devices built into the tea service itself. The ritual of serving gave Hartwell a moment to gather his thoughts, and Watson could see the man's shoulders relax slightly as the familiar comfort of British tea began to work its gentle magic. Thomas was not the sort of boy to simply wander off, Hartwell continued, accepting his cup with hands that had steadied somewhat. He was dedicated to his craft, passionate about clockwork in the way that only the truly gifted can be. He could listen to a mechanism and tell you exactly which gear was causing a problem, and could adjust a mainspring by feeling alone. He had the hands of a master artificer and the mind of an inventor. And yet he vanished without a trace, Holmes observed. His grey eyes fixed on their visitor with the particular intensity that Watson had learned meant the detective's remarkable mind was already beginning to sort and catalogue the information being presented to him. "Precisely," Hartwell said, and took a sip of his tea before continuing. But Thomas was not the end of it. 4 days later, my second apprentice, a girl named Sarah Blackwood, she disappeared as well. Same circumstances. There one moment, gone the next, as if she had simply evaporated like steam from a kettle. Watson leaned forward, his medical training making him sensitive to the patterns of human distress. "Mr. Hartwell, forgive me for asking, but have you considered that perhaps these young people simply chose to leave? Apprentices sometimes find better opportunities elsewhere, particularly in these times of rapid change." Hartwell shook his head with the firmness of absolute certainty. "Dr. Watson, I understand why you might think so, but you didn't know these children. Thomas had been with me for 3 years, Sarah for 2. They weren't just apprentices. They were like family. And more than that, they were both on the verge of major breakthroughs in their work. Thomas had been developing a new type of escapement mechanism that could regulate time with unprecedented accuracy. And Sarah had designed a gear system that could transfer power more efficiently than anything we'd seen before. The fire crackled in the grate, sending a shower of golden sparks up the chimney, and outside the gentle sounds of London's mechanical evening continued. The soft hiss of steam carriages passing in the street, the distant chime of a clockwork bell marking the hour, and the melodic whistle of an airship passing overhead on its way to one of the mooring masts that had been erected throughout the city. Holmes set down his teacup with the precise click of china against brass, a sound that seemed to punctuate the end of one phase of their conversation and the beginning of another. "Mr. Hartwell, I noticed that you referred to your apprentices being stolen, rather than simply disappearing. This suggests that you have some theory about what has become of them." "I do," Hartwell said, and his voice carried a weight of conviction that had been absent when he first began his story. 2 days after Sarah vanished, I received a visit from a man who claimed to represent a consortium of investors interested in purchasing my workshop and my apprentices' contracts. He was well dressed, spoke with the accent of education and breeding, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. "Can you describe this man?" Watson asked, his pen already moving across the pages of his notebook, in the swift, precise strokes he had developed over years of recording Holmes's cases. Tall, perhaps 6 feet in height, with dark hair that was perfectly groomed and clothes that spoke of considerable wealth. He carried a walking stick topped with silver, and he had the most unusual eyes, pale grey, almost colourless like winter fog. But it wasn't his appearance that troubled me so much as his manner. He spoke about my apprentices as if they were pieces of machinery rather than human beings, asking about their specific skills and abilities in a way that seemed calculating. Holmes steepled his fingers in the gesture that Watson recognised as indicating deep thought. And you refused his offer, I assume? Absolutely, Hartwell said with feeling. I told him that my apprentices were not for sale, that they were free individuals pursuing their craft under my guidance, not property to be bought and sold. He smiled when I said this, a cold smile that never reached those pale eyes of his, and said that perhaps I would reconsider when I understood how alone I was in that opinion. A threat, Watson observed, his pen pausing on the page. Certainly seemed so to me, Hartwell agreed, and 3 days later, my third apprentice disappeared. Peter Ashford, 19 years old, brilliant with small mechanisms and delicate work. Gone without a trace, just like the others. The room fell silent except for the gentle sounds of their mechanical world. The soft tick of the various clockwork devices on the mantelpiece, the whisper of heated air moving through the brass pipes along the walls, and the distant, comforting hum of the great steam engines that powered the city's heating and lighting systems. It was a silence that felt heavy with possibility, as if the very air around them was pregnant with the promise of mystery and adventure. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements and began to pace before the fireplace with the measured steps of a man whose mind was working through a complex problem. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his profile, casting shadows that danced across the familiar features Watson had come to know so well over their years of partnership. "Mr. Hartwell," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying the particular tone that Watson recognised as indicating that the detective had reached some preliminary conclusions. "I believe you're quite correct in your assessment that your apprentices have been taken rather than simply choosing to leave. The pattern is too clear, too methodical to be coincidence, and the visit from this mysterious gentleman confirms that there are organised forces at work." "Then you'll take the case?" Hartwell asked, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "Indeed we will," Holmes replied, turning to face their visitor with eyes that gleamed with the particular light that always appeared when he encountered a puzzle worthy of his attention. "But I must warn you that we may discover things that are difficult to accept. In my experience, when people are taken for their specific skills and knowledge, the motives of those who take them are rarely benevolent." Watson closed his notebook and set down his pen, the small click of metal against wood seeming to seal their commitment to the case. "Mr. Hartwell, we'll need to examine your workshop, speak with anyone who might have witnessed these disappearances, and learn everything we can about your apprentices' specific areas of expertise." "Of course," Hartwell said, rising from his chair with movements that seemed lighter than when he had first entered their sitting room. "I've brought photographs of the 3 missing apprentices and detailed notes about their work and their personalities. I had hoped that perhaps they might prove useful." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that bore the brass fittings and careful craftsmanship that marked it as the work of someone accustomed to creating beautiful as well as functional objects. From within, he extracted 3 photographs mounted on stiff cardstock, each one bearing the warm sepia tones that had become the standard for portrait photography in their mechanically enhanced age. Holmes accepted the photographs with the careful attention he brought to all evidence, holding each one at precisely the right angle to catch the lamplight while Watson moved to look over his shoulder. The faces that gazed back at them from the photographs were young and eager, marked by the particular combination of intelligence and enthusiasm that characterised those who had found their true calling in life. Thomas Whitmore appeared to be perhaps 16 years of age, with the fine features and bright eyes that spoke of quick wit and natural curiosity. His hair was carefully combed for the photograph, but Watson could see that it bore the slight disarray that comes from a habit of running one's fingers through it while thinking. His hands, folded carefully in his lap for the portrait, showed the telltale stains and small calluses that marked him as someone who worked with metals and precision tools. Sarah Blackwood was perhaps a year older, with dark hair that had been arranged in the modest style favoured by working young women of the time, but her eyes held a spark of determination and intelligence that spoke of someone who would not be constrained by conventional expectations. Her dress was practical rather than fashionable, made from sturdy fabric that could withstand the rigours of workshop life, and Watson could see that her hands, like Thomas's, bore the marks of someone skilled in delicate mechanical work. Peter Ashford looked older than his 19 years, with the serious expression of someone who had found his passion early in life and pursued it with single-minded dedication. His photograph showed him holding a small clockwork mechanism, his fingers positioned with the precise confidence of someone who understood exactly how each gear and spring contributed to the whole. His clothes were neat but clearly well worn, the garments of someone who cared more about function than appearance. "They're beautiful young people," Watson observed softly, and there was genuine warmth in his voice as he studied the photographs. "You can see the intelligence in their eyes, the dedication. No wonder you think of them as family." "They are family," Hartwell said simply, "and I mean to have them back, whatever it takes." Holmes set the photographs carefully on the mantelpiece, arranging them where the firelight would illuminate their faces without creating glare. "Mr. Hartwell, I want you to return to your workshop and continue with your normal routine as much as possible. Don't let anyone know that you've consulted us. If our mysterious gentleman or his associates are watching, we want them to believe that you're handling this alone." "You think they might be watching?" Hartwell asked, and Watson could hear the slight tremor in his voice at the thought. "Almost certainly," Holmes replied. "But don't let that concern you. Watson and I will begin our investigation immediately, and we'll be far more effective if those responsible believe they have nothing to fear from you." "What should I do if the man returns?" Hartwell asked. "Listen to what he has to say, but don't commit to anything," Holmes advised. "If possible, try to learn more about who he represents and what they ultimately want. Any information you can gather might prove crucial to recovering your apprentices safely." Hartwell gathered his portfolio and rose from his chair, moving with the measured steps of a man who had found new purpose and determination. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot express how grateful I am that you've agreed to help. Those children, they don't deserve whatever is happening to them." "No," Watson agreed quietly, "they don't. But we will find them, Mr. Hartwell. You have my word on that." After their visitor had departed, his footsteps echoing down the 17 stairs before fading into the gentle sounds of London's mechanical evening, Holmes and Watson remained in their sitting room, each lost in contemplation of the case that had just been placed before them. The fire had burned lower, casting longer shadows across the walls, and the various clockwork devices on the mantelpiece ticked their gentle rhythms like the heartbeat of time itself. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked finally, settling back into his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who knew he would be spending considerable time in thought and discussion. Holmes remained standing before the fireplace, his lean frame silhouetted against the warm glow of the coals. "It's fascinating, Watson. We have 3 highly skilled young people who disappear under identical circumstances, a mysterious gentleman who makes veiled threats about purchasing human contracts, and a pattern that suggests careful planning and organisation." "But why apprentices?" Watson wondered aloud. "Surely if someone wanted skilled craftspeople, there would be easier ways to acquire their services than kidnapping." "Ah, but that's exactly the point," Holmes said, turning to face his friend with eyes that gleamed with the particular intensity that appeared whenever he began to unravel the threads of a complex mystery. "Consider what we know about these 3 young people. They're not just skilled, they're innovators, inventors, creators of new techniques and mechanisms that could be worth considerable sums to the right buyer." Watson nodded slowly as the implications began to become clear. "You think someone is collecting them for their specific knowledge and abilities?" "Precisely. And consider the timing. Thomas Whitmore was developing a new escapement mechanism. Sarah Blackwood had designed an improved gear system, and Peter Ashford was skilled in delicate work that could be applied to any number of precision instruments. Taken together, they represent a concentration of talent and innovation that could be incredibly valuable to someone in the clockwork trade." "But valuable enough to justify kidnapping?" Watson asked. "Surely the risks would outweigh any potential profits." Holmes resumed his pacing, his footsteps creating a gentle rhythm on the carpeted floor. "Not if the someone in question believed they could operate with impunity. Remember, Watson, we're living in an age of rapid change, where traditional methods of business and commerce are being transformed by new technologies and new possibilities. Perhaps our mysterious gentleman represents interests that operate outside the bounds of conventional law." The room fell silent again, broken only by the soft sounds of their mechanical world and the occasional distant whistle of a late-night airship passing overhead. Watson found himself studying the photographs on the mantelpiece, trying to imagine what sort of mind could look at those bright, eager faces and see nothing more than valuable commodities to be acquired and exploited. "Holmes," he said finally, "I have the most unsettling feeling that this case is going to take us into territory we haven't explored before." "I share that feeling entirely," Holmes replied, and there was a note of anticipation in his voice that Watson recognised as indicating that the detective welcomed, rather than feared, the challenge ahead. "But that, my dear fellow, is precisely what makes it interesting." The next morning dawned grey and soft over London, with fog that seemed to embrace the city's new mechanical additions as warmly as it had always welcomed the old. Steam rose from countless chimneys and vents, creating patterns in the air that danced and swirled before dissipating into the gentle breeze that carried the mixed scents of coal smoke, brass polish, and the ozone smell of electrical workshops warming up for another day of innovation and discovery. Holmes and Watson made their way through the winding streets toward Whitechapel, travelling in one of the new steam carriages that had become increasingly common throughout London. The vehicle moved with a smooth, quiet efficiency that was a marked contrast to the bone-jarring ride of traditional horse-drawn transport, and the brass fittings and small mechanical conveniences built into the passenger compartment spoke of a world where comfort and technology had learned to work together in perfect harmony. Through the windows they could see the city waking up around them. Shopkeepers emerged from their establishments to wind the clockwork mechanisms that powered their window displays, and workers in brass-buttoned uniforms tended to the steam pipes and electrical conduits that provided power and heat to the surrounding buildings. Airships moved slowly overhead, their gas envelopes gleaming like pearls in the morning light, while message tubes sang their melodic songs as pneumatic pressure carried correspondence from building to building with speed and efficiency that would have seemed magical just a few years before. Hartwell's Clockwork Emporium occupied a corner building that had clearly been constructed during the previous century, but had been lovingly adapted to serve the needs of the new mechanical age. The ground floor featured large windows that had been fitted with brass frames designed to showcase the intricate clockwork mechanisms within, and small brass plaques beside the entrance identified the establishment as a member in good standing of both the London Artificers Guild and the Society for the Advancement of Mechanical Arts. As their steam carriage drew to a halt before the shop, Holmes and Watson could see Edmund Hartwell through the windows, bent over a workbench where brass gears and springs gleamed in the light of several oil lamps that had been fitted with precisely adjusted reflectors. He looked up at the sound of their arrival, and Watson could see that the man appeared more rested than he had the previous evening, as if simply sharing his burden had allowed him to sleep more peacefully. The interior of the shop was a marvel of organised complexity. Workbenches lined the walls, each one equipped with racks of specialised tools that gleamed like surgical instruments, and brass pipes carried heated air to precisely the locations where warmth would be most beneficial for delicate work. Shelves displayed completed clockwork mechanisms of every description, pocket watches with cases of gleaming silver, mantel clocks that chimed the hours with voices like church bells, and elaborate astronomical devices that tracked the movements of planets and stars with mechanical precision that rivaled the celestial bodies themselves. But it was the workshop area at the rear of the establishment that truly captured their attention. Here 3 workbenches stood empty, their tool racks complete but unused, their brass work surfaces polished but bearing the subtle marks that spoke of recent abandonment. Personal items remained scattered across each bench, a half-finished mechanism here, a notebook filled with precise drawings there, a small vise that had been left adjusted to hold a gear of specific dimensions. "Those were their benches," Hartwell said quietly, following their gaze. "I haven't touched anything since they disappeared. Somehow it feels wrong to disturb their work, as if doing so would be admitting that they're not coming back." Holmes moved to the nearest bench, the one that had belonged to Thomas Whitmore according to the small brass nameplate affixed to its edge. With the careful attention he brought to all evidence, he examined the tools, the work in progress, and the notebook that lay open to a page covered with precise mechanical drawings. Watson could see the detective's eyes moving across every detail, cataloguing and analysing with the systematic thoroughness that had made him London's finest consulting detective. "This escapement mechanism," Holmes said, pointing to the half-completed device that lay in the centre of the bench. "It's remarkable work for someone so young. The precision of the cutting, the innovation in the design. This represents a genuine breakthrough in clockwork engineering." Thomas was extraordinarily gifted, Hartwell agreed, moving to stand beside Holmes at the bench. He could see possibilities that escaped even experienced artificers. That particular mechanism would have allowed a timepiece to maintain accuracy, even under conditions of temperature variation and physical stress that would throw off conventional mechanisms. Watson found himself drawn to Sarah Blackwood's bench, where a complex arrangement of gears and springs lay partially assembled. The work was delicate in the extreme, requiring not just technical skill, but also an artistic sensibility that could envision how each component would interact with all the others. Her notebook, bound in leather and secured with a small brass clasp, contained page after page of calculations and drawings that spoke of a mind capable of both mathematical precision and creative innovation. Her gear system, Hartwell explained, noticing Watson's interest, was designed to transfer power with minimal loss of energy. Traditional gear trains lose efficiency at each transfer point, but Sarah had developed a tooth pattern and spacing that eliminated most of that loss. The applications would have been, well, revolutionary is not too strong a word. The third bench, Peter Ashford's workspace, was organised with the meticulous care that characterised someone who worked regularly with components so small that a moment's inattention could result in hours of lost work. Magnifying glasses of various powers were arranged in precise order, each one mounted on an adjustable brass arm that could be positioned exactly where needed. The work in progress appeared to be some sort of timing mechanism, so delicate that Watson could barely see its individual components, even with the aid of the nearest magnifying glass. Peter specialised in work that required absolute precision, Hartwell said, his voice carrying the pride of a master craftsman discussing a particularly gifted student. Chronometer escapements, regulator mechanisms, anything that needed to function with perfect accuracy over extended periods. His work was so fine that other artificers would bring their most challenging projects to him. Holmes completed his circuit of the 3 workbenches and returned to the centre of the workshop, his grey eyes thoughtful as he processed the information he had gathered. "Mr. Hartwell, I noticed that each of your apprentices was working on innovations that would have applications far beyond simple timekeeping. Thomas's escapement could regulate any mechanical process that required precise timing. Sarah's gear system could improve the efficiency of any power transmission application, and Peter's precision work would be invaluable for scientific instruments, navigation equipment, or military applications." "That's correct," Hartwell confirmed. "The clockwork trade has become much more than simply making timepieces. Our techniques and innovations have applications in everything from factory machinery to airship navigation systems. A talented artificer can find work in dozens of different industries, which makes your apprentices even more valuable to someone who understands their full potential," Watson observed, beginning to grasp the scope of what they were dealing with. "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "We're not dealing with someone who simply wants skilled workers. We're dealing with someone who specifically targeted these 3 young people for their particular innovations and abilities." "But how would anyone outside the trade know about their specific work?" Hartwell asked. "The clockwork community is relatively small, and we don't generally publicise our apprentices' individual projects." Holmes paused in his examination of the workshop, his attention caught by something that Watson couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Hartwell, do you ever receive visitors here? People who might observe your apprentices at work?" "Certainly," Hartwell replied. "We get customers who want to watch their timepieces being repaired, other artificers who come to discuss techniques and share information, suppliers who bring new materials and tools. It's a fairly active place during business hours." "And in the weeks before the disappearances began, do you recall any visitors who showed particular interest in your apprentices or their work?" Hartwell's face grew thoughtful as he considered the question. Actually, now that you mention it, there was a gentleman who visited several times in the month before Thomas disappeared. Said he was writing an article about the future of mechanical engineering for one of the trade journals. He spent considerable time talking with each of the apprentices about their work, taking notes and making sketches. Watson felt a chill of recognition. Can you describe this gentleman? Well-dressed, educated, manner of speech, carried himself like a man of breeding and wealth. He had a walking stick topped with silver, and the most unusual pale grey eyes, like winter fog. Holmes and Watson exchanged a significant glance. The same man who later offered to purchase your workshop, Holmes observed. It would seem so, Hartwell said, and Watson could hear the anger building in his voice as the implications became clear. He wasn't writing any articles. He was, what would you call it, studying them? Learning about their work so he could determine their value? I'm afraid that appears to be exactly what he was doing, Holmes confirmed. Which means this entire operation was planned well in advance, with careful attention to selecting exactly the right targets. The morning light that filtered through the shop's windows was beginning to take on the warmer tones of the advancing day, and the sounds from the street outside spoke of London's mechanical life continuing its steady rhythm. Steam carriages passed with their gentle hissing, airship engines hummed overhead, and the melodic chimes of message tubes carried news and correspondence throughout the interconnected network that bound the city together like the nervous system of some vast, benevolent organism. But within the quiet workshop, surrounded by the tools and unfinished projects of 3 missing young people, the atmosphere remained heavy with concern and determination. Holmes continued his systematic examination of every detail, occasionally making notes in the small leather notebook he always carried, while Watson found himself studying the photographs that Hartwell had provided, trying to imagine what these bright, talented young people might be experiencing wherever they had been taken. The fog of London seemed to thicken around the edges of their investigation, carrying with it not just the familiar sense of the mechanical city, but also whispers of darker possibilities that neither Holmes nor Watson dared yet to voice aloud. Somewhere in the vast labyrinth of streets and workshops, steam pipes and clockwork towers, 3 brilliant young minds were being held against their will, their knowledge and skills coveted by forces that operated in the shadows between innovation and exploitation. And as the morning progressed into afternoon, with its gentle rhythm of discovery and growing understanding, both the great detective and his loyal companion began to sense that they were approaching the edge of something far more complex and dangerous than a simple case of missing apprentices. The clockwork heart of London continued its steady beating, but within that rhythm Holmes and Watson could detect a discordant note, a whisper of conspiracy that threatened not just 3 young lives, but perhaps the very foundations of the trust and collaboration that made their mechanical paradise possible. Mr. Hartwell, Holmes said finally, I'm going to need you to think very carefully about every interaction you've had with this mysterious gentleman, every word he spoke, every question he asked, every detail you can remember about his appearance and manner. Additionally, I'll need to speak with anyone else who might have encountered him during his visits here. Of course, Hartwell replied. I've already spoken with Mrs. Pembridge next door. She manages the tea shop and has an excellent view of my front entrance. She remembers seeing the gentleman several times, and she mentioned that he always arrived and departed in the same steam carriage, a particularly elegant black model with brass fittings. Excellent, Holmes said, and Watson could hear the satisfaction in his voice that always appeared when useful information began to emerge. We'll speak with Mrs. Pembridge immediately. Watson, I believe we're dealing with someone who has considerable resources and organisation behind him. This isn't the work of a single individual operating alone. As they prepared to leave the workshop, Watson found his gaze drawn once more to the 3 empty workbenches, with their abandoned projects and personal possessions waiting patiently for their owner's return. Somewhere in London, 3 talented young people were being held against their will, their skills and knowledge being exploited by individuals who saw them as nothing more than valuable property to be acquired and used. We'll find them, he said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to Hartwell. Whatever it takes, we'll find them and bring them home. The morning air outside Hartwell's workshop carried the mixed sense of London's transformation. Coal smoke and steam, brass polish and oil, the ozone smell of electrical workshops beginning their daily work, and beneath it all the familiar dampness that had always been part of London's character, now softened and warmed by the gentle heat that radiated from the network of steam pipes that ran beneath the streets like the arteries of some great mechanical heart. Mrs. Pembridge's tea shop occupied the ground floor of the building adjacent to Hartwell's establishment, its windows gleaming with brass fittings and small mechanical conveniences that spoke of an owner who appreciated both tradition and innovation. The scent of fresh tea and warm pastries drifted from the open door, mingling with the morning air to create an atmosphere of comfort and welcome that seemed to embrace everyone who passed by. The proprietress herself was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair arranged in the practical style favoured by working women of her generation, and eyes that missed nothing that occurred within her sphere of observation. She greeted Holmes and Watson with the warm efficiency that characterised successful shopkeepers throughout London, but Watson could see that her attention was particularly focused when Hartwell introduced them as investigators looking into the disappearances of his apprentices. "Terrible business, that," she said, settling them at a table near the front window where the view of Hartwell's shop was clear and unobstructed. "Those poor children, bright as new pennies, all of them, and polite as you please. They'd stop by for tea and cakes when they had a few minutes to spare, always eager to talk about their work and their dreams for the future." Holmes accepted the cup of tea that Mrs. Pembridge placed before him, with the careful attention he brought to all social rituals, but Watson could see that his mind was entirely focused on gathering information. "Mrs. Pembridge, Mr. Hartwell mentioned that you observed a gentleman visiting his shop several times in the weeks before the disappearances began. Can you tell us about those visits?" "Indeed I can," she replied, settling into the chair opposite them with the comfortable ease of someone preparing to share information that she had been thinking about for some time. Stuck out like a sore thumb, he did, though he tried to appear casual about his interest. Well-dressed gentleman, obvious breeding, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. "Can you describe him in detail?" Watson asked, his pen moving across the pages of his notebook with the swift precision that had become second nature to him over their years of partnership. Tall man, perhaps 6 feet or a bit more, with dark hair that was always perfectly groomed. Expensive clothes, the sort that cost more than most people earn in a month, and he carried a walking stick with a silver head that caught the light when he moved. But it was his eyes that troubled me most. Pale grey, almost colourless, like looking into winter fog. Cold eyes, if you take my meaning. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent on Mrs. Pembridge's face. "You said he tried to appear casual about his interest. What gave you the impression that his casualness was an act?" "Well, for one thing, he always arrived and departed in the same steam carriage. A beautiful black vehicle with brass fittings that must have cost a fortune, but he never had the driver wait in front of the shop. Instead, the carriage would drop him off at the corner and then circle around to wait in the alley behind the buildings. Someone truly casual about their visit wouldn't go to such lengths to avoid being easily observed." Watson looked up from his notebook, struck by the implications of what Mrs. Pembridge had just revealed. "You think he was deliberately trying to avoid being seen?" "I'm certain of it," she replied firmly, "and there was his behaviour during the visits themselves. He'd spend considerable time in Hartwell's shop, always claiming to be interested in commissioning some piece of work or another, but I could see him through the windows, and his attention was always on the apprentices rather than on Hartwell, or the finished pieces on display." "Did you ever see him interact directly with the young people?" Holmes asked. "Oh yes, quite extensively. He'd engage them in conversation about their work, asking detailed questions about their techniques and their innovations. At first I thought it was rather nice, an educated gentleman taking such interest in the achievements of working young people. But after the first disappearance, I began to wonder if his interest had been more calculating." The tea shop around them hummed with the gentle activity of London's mechanical morning. Steam hissed softly from the brass heating pipes that ran along the walls, keeping the space warm and comfortable despite the autumn chill outside, and the occasional melodic chime of a message tube announced the arrival of correspondence, or orders from other establishments in the neighbourhood. But within their small circle at the window table, the atmosphere remained focused and serious as the implications of Mrs. Pembridge's observations began to become clear. Mrs. Pembridge, Holmes said, setting down his teacup with the precise click that indicated his complete attention. On the days when this gentleman visited, did you notice any other unusual activity in the area? Other vehicles, people who seemed to be watching or waiting? She considered the question carefully, her eyes growing distant as she searched her memory for details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Actually, now that you mention it, there were occasions when I noticed other people who seemed to be lingering in the area without any obvious purpose. A woman who stood at the corner reading the same newspaper for nearly an hour. A man who spent an extraordinary amount of time examining the goods in the shop window across the street. Surveillance, Watson observed quietly, and Holmes nodded in agreement. It would appear so, Holmes said. Mrs. Pembridge, did you notice the registration number, or any other identifying marks on the steam carriage? I'm afraid not, she replied apologetically. I wish I had paid closer attention, but at the time, I simply thought it was an unusual level of interest in our little corner of Whitechapel. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid motion that characterised all his movements, and Watson could see that the detective's mind was already moving ahead to the next phase of their investigation. Mrs. Pembridge, you've been extraordinarily helpful. If you happen to see this gentleman again or notice any other unusual activity in the area, please send word to us immediately at Baker Street. Of course, she replied, and Watson could hear the genuine concern in her voice as she added, I do hope you'll be able to find those poor children. They don't deserve whatever has happened to them. As they emerged from the warmth of the tea shop into the gentle bustle of Whitechapel's mechanical morning, Holmes and Watson found themselves walking slowly through streets that had been transformed by the marriage of tradition and innovation that characterised their age. Steam carriages moved with quiet efficiency alongside the occasional horse-drawn cart, while overhead, the elegant forms of passenger airships drifted like clouds against the grey sky. Well, Watson, Holmes said as they made their way toward the main thoroughfare where they could secure transportation back to Baker Street, what do you make of our mysterious gentleman now? He's clearly operating as part of a larger organisation, Watson replied, reviewing his notes as they walked. The surveillance, the expensive steam carriage, the careful planning. This isn't the work of a single individual with a sudden inspiration to acquire skilled workers. Precisely. And the level of resources at his disposal suggests that we're dealing with people who have considerable wealth and influence. The question is, what do they ultimately intend to do with our missing apprentices? They paused at the corner to wait for a steam carriage that could carry them back to more familiar territory, and Watson found himself studying the mechanical marvels that surrounded them. Message tubes sang their melodic songs as correspondents travelled through the pneumatic network. Street lamps that would soon glow with electrical illumination stood ready to banish the darkness. Darkness, and the gentle hiss of steam from countless sources created a background symphony that spoke of a world where human ingenuity had learned to work in harmony with the forces of nature. But beneath the wonder and optimism of their transformed city, Watson could sense darker currents at work. Somewhere in London, 3 talented young people were being held against their will, their knowledge and skills being exploited by individuals who saw human beings as nothing more than valuable commodities to be acquired and used. The thought filled him with a cold anger that was tempered only by his absolute confidence that Holmes would not rest until justice had been done. Their steam carriage arrived with the quiet efficiency that characterised the new transportation, and as they settled into the comfortable passenger compartment for the journey back to Baker Street, Holmes fell into the contemplative silence that Watson recognised as indicating that the detective's remarkable mind was sorting through the information they had gathered and beginning to formulate theories about what they were dealing with. The journey through London's transformed streets provided ample opportunity for observation and reflection. They passed workshops where craftsmen bent over benches filled with brass gears and springs, electrical laboratories where inventors experimented with the mysterious forces that could bring light without flame, and airship mooring masts where the great vessels of the sky prepared for journeys to distant cities and exotic destinations. But it was the people who captured Watson's attention most strongly. On every street corner, he could see individuals whose lives had been touched and transformed by the mechanical revolution that was reshaping their world. Workers in brass-buttoned uniforms tended to the steam pipes and electrical conduits that provided power and comfort to the surrounding buildings, while apprentices hurried between establishments carrying cases of precision tools and delicate mechanisms that represented the cutting edge of human innovation. Each face that passed their window reminded Watson of the 3 missing young people whose photographs now occupied places of honour on their mantelpiece at Baker Street. Somewhere in this vast, interconnected city, Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Blackwood and Peter Ashford were experiencing circumstances that no one should have to endure, their talents and dreams subordinated to the cold calculations of individuals who valued innovation only for its potential to generate profit. "Holmes," Watson said as their steam carriage turned onto Baker Street, "I have the feeling that this case is going to require us to venture into parts of London that we've never explored before." "I suspect you're quite right," Holmes replied, his grey eyes fixed on the familiar facade of their lodgings as they drew to a halt. "But that, my dear Watson, is precisely what makes it worth pursuing." The afternoon found them in the comfortable familiarity of their sitting room, surrounded by the gentle sounds of their mechanical world and the warm glow of firelight that danced across the walls. Holmes had arranged the evidence they had gathered on the small table before the fireplace. The photographs of the missing apprentices, Watson's notes from their interviews with Hartwell and Mrs. Pembridge, and several sheets of paper covered with the detective's precise handwriting as he worked to organise and analyse the information they had collected. "The pattern is becoming clear," Holmes said, settling into his chair with the particular intensity that appeared when he was working through a complex problem. "Our mysterious gentleman and his associates have identified 3 highly talented young people whose innovations could be worth considerable sums to the right buyer. They've conducted careful surveillance to learn about their target's specific abilities and daily routines, and they've executed the kidnappings with a precision that suggests military or criminal organisation." Watson nodded as he reviewed his own notes, adding occasional observations as details that had seemed insignificant at the time began to reveal their true importance. But why apprentices rather than established masters? Surely experienced artificers would have even more valuable knowledge and skills. "An excellent question," Holmes replied, rising from his chair to pace before the fireplace with the measured steps that accompanied his deepest thinking. "But consider the practical aspects of the situation. Established masters have families, business obligations, social connections that would make their disappearance immediately obvious and difficult to conceal. Apprentices, particularly those without extensive family ties, can vanish with much less immediate attention. And they're more vulnerable," Watson added, understanding beginning to dawn as he considered the psychological aspects of their quarry's methodology. Young people can be more easily intimidated, controlled and manipulated than experienced adults who have developed confidence and independence. Precisely, our missing apprentices represent the perfect combination of valuable skills and controllable circumstances. They possess knowledge and abilities that could be worth fortunes to the right buyer, but they lack the resources and connections that would make their rescue a matter of immediate public concern. The fire crackled in the grate, sending golden shadows dancing across the familiar objects that filled their sitting room, and outside the gentle sounds of London's mechanical evening began to replace the busier rhythms of the afternoon. Steam carriages passed with their soft hissing. Airship engines hummed overhead as the great vessels prepared for night flights to distant destinations, and the melodic chimes of message tubes carried correspondence through the pneumatic network that connected every building in their neighbourhood. "Holmes," Watson said, setting down his pen and leaning back in his chair with the gesture of a man who had reached an important conclusion, "I think we need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with something much larger than simple kidnapping for ransom." "What do you mean?" "Think about what we know," Watson said, his medical training making him naturally inclined to systematic analysis of complex problems. "We have 3 young people who have developed innovations that could revolutionize mechanical engineering, taken by individuals with considerable resources and organisation. What if this isn't about ransoming them back to their families or even selling them to the highest bidder? What if someone is collecting them for a specific purpose? Holmes paused in his pacing, his attention caught by the implications of Watson's observation. You think someone is assembling a team of specialists for some particular project? It would explain the careful selection process, the surveillance, the resources being devoted to the operation. If someone needed exactly the type of expertise that Thomas, Sarah and Peter possess, they might be willing to go to considerable lengths to acquire it. The detective returned to his chair, settling into the familiar leather, with eyes that gleamed with the particular light that appeared whenever a new possibility presented itself for consideration. Watson, you may have identified something crucial. If our mysterious gentleman represents interests that are assembling a team of specialists, then the question becomes, what sort of project would require such a specific combination of skills? Thomas's work on precision timing mechanisms, Sarah's gear systems for efficient power transmission, Peter's expertise with delicate precision work, Watson mused, reviewing the notes that described each apprentice's particular abilities. Taken together, they represent a concentration of talent that could be applied to almost any complex mechanical project. But not just any project, Holmes observed, his mind clearly working through the possibilities with systematic thoroughness. Something that requires innovations in timing, power transmission, and precision engineering simultaneously. Something that existing techniques and methods cannot accomplish. The room fell silent except for the gentle background symphony of their mechanical world, and Watson found himself staring into the fire as he tried to imagine what sort of undertaking would justify such elaborate preparations and such considerable risk. The flames danced and flickered, casting ever-changing patterns of light and shadow across the walls, while the photographs of the 3 missing apprentices seemed to watch from their place on the mantelpiece with expressions of youthful hope and determination that made their current circumstances all the more heartbreaking. A weapon, Watson said suddenly, the word emerging from his thoughts with the force of absolute conviction. Holmes, what if someone is trying to build a weapon? Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his grey eyes intent on Watson's face. Explain your reasoning. Military applications would justify almost any level of expense and risk, Watson said, his thoughts coming together with the clarity that sometimes emerged when disparate pieces of information suddenly revealed their connections to each other. And the specific combination of skills, precision timing for coordinated mechanisms, efficient power transmission for maximum force or speed, delicate engineering for complex triggering or guidance systems, it all fits. It does indeed, Holmes agreed, and Watson could hear the excitement building in his voice as the possibility took shape in his mind. And it would explain why our mysterious gentleman was so confident in his threat to Hartwell. If he represents military or government interests, he might well believe that he can operate with impunity. But military or government interests working outside the law, Watson asked. Surely there are legitimate ways to commission the sort of work you're describing. Not if the work itself is illegitimate, Holmes replied grimly. Watson, what if we're dealing with someone who wants to develop weapons or military technologies that the official authorities would never sanction? Someone who needs the expertise but cannot risk the scrutiny that would come with legitimate contracts and official oversight. The implications of what they were discussing settled over them like a cold fog, and Watson found himself gripping the arms of his chair as he considered what 3 talented young people might be forced to create under such circumstances. The mechanical marvels that surrounded them in their comfortable sitting room, the brass pipes that carried heated air, the clockwork devices that marked the passage of time, the electrical lamps that banished darkness. All of these innovations had been created by individuals who shared the same passion for discovery and invention that drove Thomas, Sarah and Peter in their work. But in the wrong hands, that same passion could be turned to purposes that its original creators never intended or desired. The precision engineering that could create a chronometer capable of keeping perfect time could also create timing mechanisms for explosive devices. The gear systems that could improve the efficiency of factory machinery could also be applied to weapons that could cause destruction on an unprecedented scale. Holmes, Watson said quietly, if you're right about this, then we're not just dealing with kidnapping. We're dealing with people who are planning something that could threaten the safety of countless innocent people. Which means, Holmes replied, rising from his chair with a fluid motion that indicated his transition from contemplation to action, that finding our missing apprentices has become a matter of urgent national importance. The evening light that filtered through their sitting room windows was beginning to fade into the deeper tones of approaching night, and throughout London, the great mechanical systems that powered and heated the city were settling into their nocturnal rhythms. Street lamps began to glow with the warm light of gas and electricity. Airships passed overhead with navigation lights that twinkled like moving stars, and the message tubes sang their gentle songs as the day's final correspondence travelled through the pneumatic network. But within the comfortable walls of Baker Street, Holmes and Watson found themselves confronting the possibility that their investigation had led them to the edge of something far more dangerous and significant than a simple case of missing persons. If their theories were correct, then somewhere in London 3 talented young people were being forced to contribute their skills and knowledge to a project that could threaten the peace and safety of their entire nation. "What do we do now?" Watson asked, and his voice carried the weight of a man who understood that they had moved beyond the realm of ordinary criminal investigation into territory where the stakes could hardly be higher. "Now," Holmes replied, moving to the window where he could look out over the familiar streets of their neighbourhood. "We begin the most dangerous phase of our investigation. If we're dealing with military or government interests operating outside the law, then we can expect them to take whatever measures they deem necessary to protect their operation, including eliminating anyone who gets too close to discovering what they're doing." "Almost certainly," Holmes confirmed grimly. "Which means that from this point forward, Watson, we must assume that we are being watched, and that our own lives may be in considerable danger." The next morning brought with it both the gentle fog that was London's faithful companion, and news that would transform their investigation from a matter of urgent concern into a race against time itself. Holmes was awakened before dawn by the urgent chiming of the message tube that connected their sitting room to the street below, followed immediately by the rapid footsteps of Mrs. Hudson, climbing the 17 stairs with unusual haste. "Mr. Holmes," she called through the speaking trumpet, her voice carrying a note of alarm that Watson had rarely heard from their usually composed landlady. "There's a constable here from Scotland Yard who says Inspector Lestrade needs to see you immediately." The constable proved to be a young man whose uniform bore the brass buttons and mechanical conveniences that marked him as one of the new generation of police officers who had adapted to London's transformed landscape. His face was pale with exhaustion and something that might have been fear, and his hands trembled slightly as he delivered his message. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone who was repeating instructions he had memorized precisely. "Inspector Lestrade requests your immediate presence at Scotland Yard. He said to tell you that several more workshops have reported missing apprentices, and that the pattern suggests we may be dealing with something that threatens the security of the entire realm." Holmes was already moving toward his wardrobe before the constable had finished speaking, his movements carrying the focused urgency that appeared whenever he sensed that events were moving beyond anyone's control. "Constable, when did these additional disappearances occur?" "Over the past 3 days, sir. 7 more young people, all with specialised skills in mechanical engineering or precision craftsmanship. Inspector Lestrade said the reports came in so quickly that Scotland Yard has established a special task force to coordinate the investigation." Watson felt a chill of terrible understanding as the scope of what they were dealing with began to become clear. "Holmes, if they're taking apprentices from multiple workshops, then they're moving into the final phase of whatever operation they're conducting," Holmes confirmed grimly, pulling on his coat with swift, efficient movements. "Watson, I fear we may be running out of time." The journey to Scotland Yard took them through London's awakening streets, where the familiar sounds and sights of the mechanical morning seemed to take on new and ominous meanings. Steam carriages moved with their usual efficiency, but Watson found himself wondering if any of them might be carrying agents of the conspiracy they were investigating. Airships passed overhead with their navigation lights blinking in the dawn sky, but he could not shake the feeling that they too might be part of the network of surveillance and communication that seemed to surround their quarry. Scotland Yard itself had been transformed over the past decade by the same mechanical innovations that had revolutionised the rest of London. Message tubes connected every office and department, allowing for rapid communication and coordination of investigations. Electrical lighting had replaced the old gas lamps, providing clearer illumination for the examination of evidence and the preparation of reports, and steam-powered printing presses could produce copies of wanted notices and case summaries with speed and efficiency that would have been impossible just a few years before. Inspector Lestrade met them in the main corridor, his usually composed features marked by exhaustion and deep concern. "Holmes, Watson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "I'm afraid the situation has become far more serious than any of us initially suspected." "How many more have been taken?" Holmes asked without preamble. 7 confirmed disappearances in the past 3 days, Lestrade replied, leading them toward the conference room where the task force had been established. "But that's not the worst of it. We've also received reports of suspicious approaches to dozens of other workshops throughout London and the surrounding areas. Someone is conducting a systematic survey of every skilled apprentice in the metropolitan area." The conference room buzzed with activity as detectives, clerks and analysts worked to organise and analyse the flood of information that had begun pouring in from across the city. Maps covered one wall, marked with pins that indicated the locations of confirmed disappearances and reported suspicious activity. Tables groaned under the weight of files, photographs and witness statements that chronicled what was beginning to appear as the largest criminal conspiracy in London's recent history. "Gentlemen," Lestrade said, addressing the assembled investigators, "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson have been investigating the original disappearances from Hartwell's workshop. Their insights may prove crucial to understanding what we're dealing with." Holmes moved to the map-covered wall, his grey eyes scanning the pattern of pins with the systematic attention he brought to all evidence. "Inspector, the distribution of these incidents suggests that our quarry is working to a specific timeline and geographic plan. The disappearances are clustered around areas with the highest concentration of skilled workshops, and the timing suggests they're accelerating their operations." "Which implies what?" asked Detective Sergeant Hopkins, a young officer whose brass-buttoned uniform gleamed with the mechanical conveniences that had become standard for modern police work. "That they're approaching the completion of whatever project requires these particular skills," Watson replied, studying the photographs and case files that documented each disappearance. "Holmes and I believe someone is assembling a team of specialists to develop some sort of advanced weapon or military technology." "A weapon?" Lestrade's voice carried a note of alarm that reflected the concerns of everyone in the room. "Consider the specific skills that have been targeted," Holmes said, moving to the table where the case files were arranged. "Precision timing mechanisms, efficient power transmission, delicate engineering work, material science, electrical applications. Taken together, they represent virtually every aspect of advanced mechanical and electrical engineering that would be required for the development of sophisticated military equipment." The room fell silent as the implications of what Holmes was suggesting settled over the assembled investigators. Outside, London continued its mechanical morning routine, but within the walls of Scotland Yard, the men charged with protecting the city's safety found themselves confronting the possibility that their greatest threat might come not from foreign enemies, but from individuals operating within their own society. "If you're right about this," Lestrade said finally, "then we're not just dealing with criminal kidnapping. We're dealing with a conspiracy that could threaten the security of the entire nation." "Precisely," Holmes agreed, "which means we need to approach this investigation with resources and urgency that match the scale of the threat we're facing." Over the following hours, as reports continued to arrive from across the metropolitan area, the true scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. The mysterious gentleman with the pale grey eyes had been seen at workshops throughout London, always asking the same sorts of questions about apprentices and their specific innovations. The elegant black steam carriage had been spotted in dozens of neighbourhoods, its occupants apparently conducting surveillance of potential targets. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports of a woman who claimed to represent something called the Imperial Institute for Advanced Mechanical Sciences, approaching workshop owners with offers to provide advanced training for their most promising apprentices. Several masters had been tempted by the prestigious-sounding opportunity, and their apprentices had departed for the Institute's supposed facilities in the countryside outside London. "None of them have been heard from since," Lestrade reported as the task force worked through the afternoon and into the evening. and our inquiries have revealed that no such institution has been officially registered or recognised by any government authority. A completely fabricated organisation, Watson observed, making notes as the evidence accumulated. But one sophisticated enough to fool experienced craftsmen into believing it was legitimate, which again suggests that we're dealing with people who have considerable resources and official connections, Holmes added. The creation of false documentation, the establishment of convincing cover stories, the coordination of activities across such a wide geographic area. This level of organisation requires more than simple criminal enterprise. As night settled over London, the task force had compiled enough evidence to confirm their worst fears. At least 23 skilled young people had been taken or lured away under false pretences, all of them possessing specific technical abilities that could be applied to the development of advanced weapon systems. The pattern of recruitment suggested that the operation was nearing completion, which meant that whatever the kidnapped apprentices were being forced to create might soon be ready for use. "We need to find where they're being held," Holmes said as the investigators gathered around the map one final time before breaking for the night. "But given the sophistication of this operation, I suspect their base of operations will be well hidden and heavily defended." "Any suggestions on where to start looking?" Lestrade asked. Holmes studied the map for a long moment, his mind working through the geographical and logistical requirements that such an operation would demand. The apprentices would need to be housed and fed, the work would require specialised equipment and materials, and the entire operation would need to be isolated enough to avoid detection. "I suspect we're looking for a large estate or industrial facility in the countryside outside London, probably connected to the railway network for transportation, but far enough from populated areas to ensure privacy." "That still covers a considerable area," Detective Sergeant Hopkins observed. "True," Holmes agreed, "but we can narrow the possibilities by focusing on properties that have changed hands recently or shown unusual activity. Watson and I will begin investigating tomorrow, starting with properties along the railway lines that serve the Thames Valley." As they prepared to leave Scotland Yard, Watson found himself looking back at the map with its cluster of pins marking the locations where talented young people had vanished into the shadows of conspiracy and exploitation. Somewhere out there, Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Blackwood, Peter Ashford, and 20 others were experiencing circumstances that no one should have to endure, their skills and knowledge being turned to purposes that could threaten the safety of countless innocent people. "Holmes," he said, as they emerged into the fog-shrouded streets of London's mechanical night, "I have the feeling that tomorrow is going to be the most dangerous day of our investigation." "I share that feeling entirely," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the quiet determination that Watson had learned to associate with his friend's most focused and resolute moods. "But Watson, those young people are depending on us to find them before it's too late. Whatever the risks, we cannot fail them." The fog that embraced London that night seemed thicker and more mysterious than usual, carrying with it not just the familiar sense of the mechanical city, but also whispers of secrets hidden in the darkness and dangers that lurked just beyond the comfortable glow of the street lamps. As Holmes and Watson made their way back to Baker Street, both men understood that they were approaching the climax of an investigation that had already taken them further into the shadows of conspiracy and corruption than either had initially imagined possible. And in the comfortable warmth of their sitting room, as they settled down to plan their strategy for the crucial day ahead, the photographs of 3 missing young people continued to watch from their place on the mantelpiece, their bright eyes and hopeful expressions serving as a constant reminder of what was at stake and why the risks they were about to take were absolutely necessary. The clockwork heart of London continued its steady rhythm through the night, but within that familiar beat, Holmes and Watson could detect the urgent pulse of time running out, carrying them inexorably toward a confrontation with forces that threatened not just individual lives, but the very principles of justice and human dignity that made their mechanical paradise worth preserving. The dawn that broke over London the following morning carried with it an unusual quality of urgency, as if the very air itself understood that the day ahead would bring revelations and confrontations that could change the course of many lives. The fog that had embraced the city through the night began to lift with the first rays of sunlight, revealing a metropolis that hummed with its usual mechanical energy, but seemed somehow more alert, more watchful, as if the great organism of London's collective consciousness had sensed that danger lurked within its brass-fitted arteries. Holmes and Watson emerged from Baker Street into this atmosphere of heightened awareness, their movements carrying the focused determination of men who understood that time was no longer their ally. The steam carriage that carried them toward the railway station moved through streets where every face seemed potentially significant, every mechanical sound potentially ominous, and every shadow potentially concealing threats that could emerge without warning. "Watson," Holmes said as they settled into their seats for the journey toward the Thames Valley, "I want you to understand that what we're likely to discover today may challenge everything we thought we knew about the scope and nature of this conspiracy. If our theories are correct, we may find ourselves confronting not just criminal enterprise, but organised betrayal at levels of society we had hoped remained above such corruption." Watson nodded as he checked the contents of his medical bag, which now contained not just his traditional healing instruments, but also several items that might prove useful in more dangerous circumstances. "Holmes, I've been thinking about the implications of what we discussed yesterday. If someone is indeed developing weapons that could operate without human control, then we're potentially dealing with technology that could change the very nature of warfare itself." "Precisely. And the moral implications of such development are staggering. Imagine weapons that could select and attack targets based on mechanical calculations rather than human judgment, devices that could kill without conscience or mercy, or the possibility of restraint." The countryside that passed their window as the train carried them away from London's mechanical heart seemed peaceful and pastoral, but Watson found himself studying every estate and industrial building with new suspicion. Somewhere among these rolling hills and quiet villages, 23 talented young people were being held against their will, their knowledge and skills being perverted for purposes that could threaten the safety of countless innocent lives. The station where they disembarked served a small market town that had grown prosperous through its connections to London's expanding railway network. Steam-powered omnibuses carried passengers between the station and the surrounding countryside, and the local inn featured the brass fittings and mechanical conveniences that had become standard even in rural establishments. But beneath this veneer of progress and prosperity, Holmes and Watson sensed currents of unease that suggested not everyone in the area was comfortable with recent developments. Their inquiries at the station revealed that several groups of well-dressed young people had indeed passed through in recent weeks, always accompanied by official-looking escorts and travelling to destinations that were described vaguely as educational facilities or training institutes. The station master, a sharp-eyed man whose uniform bore the brass insignia of his position, remembered the parties clearly because of the unusual combination of youth and apparent reluctance displayed by many of the travellers. "Seemed odd to me," he confided as he led Holmes and Watson to his office overlooking the platforms. "Young people going off to some grand opportunity, but half of them looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and their escorts, well, they had the bearing of men accustomed to ensuring that orders were followed, if you take my meaning." "Can you describe these escorts?" Holmes asked, settling into the chair the station master offered while Watson took notes. "Military bearing, most of them. Not necessarily active service, but the sort of men who'd learned to command and expected to be obeyed. Well-dressed, well-spoken, but there was something about them that made me think twice about asking too many questions." "And the destination of these parties?" "Always tickets for Millbrook Halt, about 15 miles northeast of here. Tiny station that serves just a few estates in that area. But what struck me as odd was that they never seemed to have return tickets, and I never saw any of those young people coming back through here." Holmes and Watson exchanged a significant glance. Millbrook Halt was little more than a platform and a small waiting room, serving an area of large estates and country houses that had been built during more prosperous times, but had fallen on harder circumstances in recent decades. It would be exactly the sort of location where a clandestine operation could establish itself without attracting unwanted attention. The journey to Millbrook Halt took them through countryside that grew progressively more isolated and sparsely populated. The train itself was nearly empty, carrying only a handful of passengers who appeared to be local residents travelling between rural communities. But as they approached their destination, Watson noticed that the conductor seemed unusually nervous, checking and rechecking tickets and making frequent glances toward the windows as if expecting to see something troubling in the passing landscape. Millbrook Halt proved to be exactly what the station master had described: a simple platform with a small shelter, surrounded by rolling hills dotted with the occasional farmhouse or country estate. The station building itself was little more than a wooden structure that housed a ticket office and waiting room, both of which appeared to be staffed only when trains were scheduled to arrive. But it was the road that led away from the station that captured Holmes's attention. Well maintained and recently improved with a surface that could accommodate heavy traffic, it wound through the hills toward what appeared to be a substantial estate, whose chimneys were just visible above the tree line several miles distant. "That road has seen considerable use recently," Holmes observed, examining the wheel ruts and hoof prints that mark the surface. "Heavy carriages, multiple horses, and steam vehicles of substantial size. Far more traffic than a simple country estate would normally generate." They followed the road through landscape that seemed peaceful and bucolic, but Watson found himself increasingly aware of small details that suggested they were approaching something far from ordinary. Telegraph lines ran parallel to the road, carrying more wires than would be necessary for simple communication with the outside world. The fencing along the roadside was in excellent repair and appeared to be designed more for keeping people in than keeping livestock contained. And in the distance, the sound of machinery suggested industrial activity on a scale that would be unusual for a rural location. The estate that finally came into view as they crested a small hill was indeed substantial, but it had clearly been extensively modified from its original residential purpose. Additional buildings had been constructed behind the main house, their architecture functional rather than decorative, and their smokestacks spoke of workshops and laboratories rather than domestic activity. A high wall surrounded the entire complex, topped with what appeared to be recently installed security measures, and the main gate was staffed by guards whose bearing and equipment marked them as professional security personnel rather than ordinary estate workers. "Well, Watson," Holmes said quietly as they observed the complex from their concealed position among the trees, "I believe we found what we were looking for. The question now is how to gain access without alerting the occupants to our presence." "Those guards look like they would be difficult to approach openly," Watson observed, studying the main gate through Holmes's enhanced magnifying glass. "But perhaps there's another way to reach the complex." They spent the better part of the afternoon conducting a careful reconnaissance of the estate's perimeter, moving through the surrounding woods with the caution of men who understood that discovery could mean not just failure, but also the elimination of any chance to rescue the kidnapped apprentices. What they found confirmed their worst fears about the scope and sophistication of the operation they were investigating. The estate had been transformed into what could only be described as a clandestine weapons development facility. The workshops they could observe through the windows were equipped with machinery and instruments that represented the cutting edge of mechanical and electrical engineering. Steam engines provided power for equipment that hummed and sparkled with electrical energy, while precision tools and measurement devices spoke of work that required the highest levels of technical skill and innovation. But it was the human activity they observed that provided the most disturbing confirmation of their theories. Young people who matched the descriptions of the missing apprentices could be seen working at benches and machinery, but their movements carried none of the enthusiasm and creativity that had characterized their work in their original workshops. Instead, they moved with the mechanical precision of individuals who understood that any deviation from assigned tasks could result in severe consequences. "They're being forced to work under duress," Watson whispered, as they watched through a window of one of the workshops. "Look at the way they keep glancing toward those men in the corners, clearly guards positioned to ensure compliance." "And look at what they're working on," Holmes added, adjusting his magnifying glass to examine the devices being assembled on the workshop benches. Those appeared to be components for some sort of autonomous mechanism, devices that could operate independently once activated. The machinery being constructed was unlike anything either Holmes or Watson had seen before. It combined the precision clockwork that had made London famous with electrical components and control systems that seemed designed to make decisions without human intervention. The implications were terrifying. Weapons that could select targets, navigate to their objectives, and carry out attacks without requiring operators who might hesitate or refuse orders that violated moral principles. As the afternoon progressed into evening, they observed the arrival of several well-dressed individuals whose bearing and manner suggested they represented the interests funding this clandestine operation. These visitors were escorted through the workshops by men who were clearly the project's technical directors, and their animated discussions suggested that the work was approaching some sort of crucial milestone. "Watson," Holmes said as they prepared to withdraw to plan their next move, "I believe we're witnessing the final preparations for a demonstration of whatever these people have created. If we're going to intervene, it must be tonight." "But how can we possibly infiltrate such a well-guarded facility?" Watson asked. "Even if we could get past the perimeter security, we'd still need to locate and evacuate 23 people without alerting the entire complex." "Not necessarily," Holmes replied, his grey eyes gleaming with the particular intensity that appeared when he was formulating a plan that combined audacity with careful calculation. "Watson, what if our goal isn't to evacuate the apprentices, but rather to ensure that the weapons they've been forced to create can never be used for their intended purpose?" As darkness settled over the Thames Valley, carrying with it the soft sounds of a countryside at rest, Holmes and Watson made their final preparations for what they both understood would be the most dangerous undertaking of their investigative partnership. The fog that began to gather in the low-lying areas around the estate would provide cover for their approach, but it would also conceal the movements of guards and security personnel who knew the grounds far better than they did. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting to overcome the estate's security through force, they would rely on the very mechanical systems that powered the weapons development facility to create the disruption they needed. Holmes had observed that the complex depended on a central steam plant to provide power for its workshops and laboratories, and he had identified the specific components that could be modified to create what he euphemistically termed a significant mechanical failure. "The beauty of it," he explained as they made their final approach through the gathering fog, "is that it will appear to be exactly what our quarry most fears, an accident during the demonstration of their weapons that destroys not only the devices themselves, but also all the technical knowledge and expertise they've assembled to create them." "And the apprentices?" Watson asked, his medical training making him constantly aware of the human costs of any plan that involved mechanical failure on such a scale. "We'll have the best possible chance of survival if they're warned in advance and know to move away from the demonstration area when the disruption begins," Holmes replied. "But Watson, I must be honest with you. This plan involves considerable risk, not just to ourselves, but to everyone in that complex, if we miscalculate the timing or the extent of the mechanical failure." "Then we may all pay the ultimate price," Watson finished quietly. "But Holmes, if we don't act tonight, those weapons may be demonstrated successfully and then deployed against innocent people. The risk to ourselves pales in comparison to our responsibility to prevent that outcome." The approach to the estate's steam plant required them to cross several hundred yards of open ground where discovery would mean certain capture or worse. The fog provided some concealment, but the facility's security lighting created pools of harsh illumination that had to be avoided at all costs. They moved with the careful patience of men who understood that haste could be fatal, timing their movements to coincide with the guard patrols and taking advantage of every shadow and depression in the terrain. The steam plant itself was housed in a substantial brick building that hummed with the mechanical energy of boilers and engines operating at full capacity. The complexity of the installation was impressive. Multiple boilers fed a network of steam pipes that carried power throughout the complex, while electrical generators provided lighting and power for the more delicate instruments and machinery. But Holmes had identified the critical weakness in the system, a pressure relief mechanism that could be modified to create catastrophic failure if the right adjustments were made at precisely the right time. "The challenge," he whispered as they approached the plant building, "is to make the modifications without alerting the operators, and then to ensure that the failure occurs during tomorrow's demonstration rather than immediately. The entry into the plant building required them to overcome a lock that combined traditional mechanical components with newer electrical alarm systems. But Holmes's enhanced tools and Watson's steady hands proved equal to the challenge, and they found themselves inside the facility without triggering any obvious security measures. The interior of the plant was a cathedral of mechanical engineering, with massive boilers and engines arranged in precise geometric patterns that spoke of careful planning and meticulous maintenance. Steam pipes snaked across the ceiling and along the walls, carrying the power that drove every machine and device in the complex. The air was thick with the scent of hot metal and lubricating oil, and the constant rhythm of mechanical operation created a hypnotic background symphony that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of some vast mechanical organism. Holmes moved through the installation with the confidence of someone who understood the principles governing its operation, his trained eye identifying the specific components that would need to be modified to achieve their goal. The pressure relief system was located near the main boiler assembly, protected by safety mechanisms that were designed to prevent exactly the sort of tampering they were attempting. "This will require precise timing," Holmes murmured, as he began the delicate work of adjusting the relief mechanism's settings. "Too little modification, and the system will simply shut down safely when the pressure builds. Too much, and the failure will occur immediately, which could alert them to sabotage and allow them to abort tomorrow's demonstration." Watson stood watch while Holmes worked, his medical training making him acutely aware of the human costs that would result if their plan succeeded. The apprentices in the workshops, the guards and technicians throughout the complex, even the visitors who represented the interests funding this conspiracy, all of them would be at risk when the mechanical failure occurred. But the alternative was to allow weapons of unprecedented destructiveness to be completed and deployed against targets who would have no defense against autonomous killing machines. The modification work took nearly 2 hours, during which every sound from outside the plant building could have signalled the approach of security personnel who had detected their presence. Holmes worked with the concentrated precision that had made him London's finest consulting detective, adjusting pressures and tensions with the careful attention of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. When he finally stepped back from the relief mechanism, his face carried the grim satisfaction of someone who had completed a task that was both necessary and terrible. "It's done," he said quietly. "When the system reaches peak operating pressure tomorrow, the relief mechanism will fail and create a steam explosion that should destroy most of the workshop facilities and all the weapons they contain. The timing should allow anyone in the immediate area to escape if they're warned in advance." "And how do we warn the apprentices without alerting the guards?" Watson asked. "We don't," Holmes replied grimly. "Watson, the risk of discovery is too great. We'll have to trust that when the explosion occurs, everyone's natural instinct will be to move away from the source of danger. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do under the circumstances." The journey back through the estate grounds was even more treacherous than their initial approach, as the security patrols had been increased for the night before the demonstration. They moved through fog that seemed to have thickened with the late hour, using every shadow and depression to avoid the pools of harsh light that marked the patrol routes. Several times they were forced to lie motionless for long minutes, while guards passed within feet of their hiding places, the sound of boots on gravel, and the occasional low conversation marking the passage of men who were alert for exactly the sort of intrusion they represented. But finally, they reached the safety of the woods beyond the estate's perimeter, where they could breathe freely for the first time in hours and begin to process what they had accomplished and what it might mean for the 23 young people whose fate now depended on their actions. "Holmes," Watson said as they made their way back toward the railway station, "what have we done? Are we heroes who have prevented a terrible weapon from being deployed, or are we criminals who have potentially condemned innocent people to death?" "We are men who have made an impossible choice in circumstances that offered no perfect solutions," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the weight of moral complexity that had characterized their entire investigation. "Watson, if those weapons had been completed and demonstrated successfully, they could have been deployed against targets throughout Britain and the Empire. The technology we observed represents a fundamental change in the nature of warfare, the ability to kill without conscience, mercy, or the possibility of restraint. But the apprentices will have the same chance of survival as everyone else in that complex when the explosion occurs. It's not perfect, Watson, but it may be the best outcome we could achieve under such terrible circumstances. The train that carried them back toward London moved through a landscape that seemed transformed by what they had witnessed and what they had done. The fog that embraced the countryside no longer seemed merely atmospheric, but rather like a metaphorical shroud that concealed the true nature of the world they inhabited. A place where innovation and progress could be perverted for the most destructive of purposes, and where the defence of human dignity sometimes required actions that violated every principle of civilised behaviour. As they settled into their seats for the journey back to Baker Street, both men found themselves confronting the moral ambiguity of their situation. They had taken action that could prevent weapons of unprecedented destructiveness from being deployed against innocent people, but that action had also placed at risk the very individuals they had originally set out to rescue. "Holmes," Watson said finally, as the lights of London began to appear in the distance, "how will we ever know if what we did was right?" "We won't," Holmes replied simply. "Watson, that's the burden of moral action in an immoral world. Sometimes we must choose between terrible alternatives and hope that our choice serves the greater good, even when we cannot be certain of the outcome." The next morning brought news that transformed their moral uncertainty into something approaching relief, though tinged with tragedy that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The newspapers carried reports of a catastrophic industrial accident at a private research facility in the Thames Valley, where a steam plant explosion had destroyed several buildings and resulted in multiple casualties. But the most significant news came from Inspector Lestrade, who arrived at Baker Street before Holmes and Watson had finished their morning tea. The inspector's face carried the complex expression of a man who was struggling to balance relief at a successful outcome with sorrow at the human costs involved. "Holmes, Watson," he said as he settled into the chair they offered, "I thought you should hear this directly rather than reading it in the newspapers. The explosion at that facility yesterday morning resulted in the complete destruction of what appears to have been an illegal weapons development operation." "And the casualties?" Watson asked, his medical training making him focus immediately on the human costs. "Lighter than might have been expected given the scale of the destruction," Lestrade replied. "Several of the security personnel and technical staff were killed or seriously injured, but most of the young people who were being held there managed to escape with relatively minor injuries." Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his grey eyes intense with concern. "Most of them. 18 of the 23 apprentices who had been kidnapped were recovered alive," Lestrade confirmed. 5 others, including 3 from Hartwell's workshop, were found among the casualties. The weight of that information settled over the sitting room like a physical presence, and Watson found himself looking at the photographs on the mantelpiece with a mixture of relief and profound sadness. Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Blackwood, and Peter Ashford would not be returning to their workbenches in Whitechapel, their bright futures cut short by the conspiracy that had sought to exploit their talents for destructive purposes. "What happened to them?" Holmes asked quietly. "According to the survivors, they had been working in the area closest to the steam plant when the explosion occurred," Lestrade explained. "But there's something else. Something that suggests their deaths may not have been simply the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time." "What do you mean?" "Several of the surviving apprentices have reported that those 3, along with the other 2 who were killed, had been planning some sort of coordinated action to sabotage the weapons they were being forced to create. They may have been deliberately positioning themselves to ensure maximum damage to the project when the explosion occurred." Watson felt a chill of recognition and admiration as he realised what Lestrade was suggesting. They were willing to sacrifice themselves to ensure that their innovations could never be used for mass destruction. "It appears so," Lestrade confirmed. "The surviving apprentices described Thomas Whitmore as having emerged as a leader among the kidnapped young people, organising resistance and planning sabotage even though they all understood the personal risks involved." Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood looking at the photographs of the 3 young people who had become the heart of their investigation. "They died as heroes," he said finally. "Not just victims of a criminal conspiracy, but active participants in its destruction." "Indeed they did," Lestrade agreed. and their sacrifice was not in vain. The weapons technology that was being developed at that facility has been completely destroyed, along with all the technical documentation and prototypes. The individuals who are funding and directing the operation have fled or been arrested, and the threat they represented has been eliminated. The investigation's conclusion brought with it a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow that would characterise Holmes and Watson's memories of the case for years to come. Justice had been served and a terrible threat had been eliminated, but the price had been paid by exactly the sort of bright, talented young people whose protection should have been society's highest priority. Edmund Hartwell, when they brought him the news of his apprentice's fate, received it with the stoic dignity of a man who had already prepared himself for the worst while hoping for the best. His workshop would continue, training new apprentices in the arts of clockwork engineering, but the 3 empty workbenches would remain exactly as their occupants had left them, serving as a memorial to young lives cut short and as a reminder of the moral responsibilities that came with innovation and discovery. Mrs. Pembridge continued to serve tea and observe the comings and goings in her corner of Whitechapel, but her conversations with customers now often included stories about the 3 remarkable young people who had once brightened her shop with their enthusiasm and dreams. The London Artificers Guild established a memorial fund in their honour, providing scholarships for apprentices who demonstrated both technical skill and moral character. Inspector Lestrade received commendation for his role in exposing and stopping the conspiracy, though the full details of the investigation remained classified to protect national security interests. Scotland Yard implemented new protocols for identifying and investigating organised criminal activity that might threaten public safety, ensuring that future conspiracies would face more systematic and coordinated opposition. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the case was its effect on Holmes and Watson themselves. The moral complexities they had encountered and the impossible choices they had been forced to make deepened their understanding of the responsibilities that came with their unique abilities and position in society. They continued their work as London's finest consulting detectives, but with a heightened awareness of the larger implications of their actions, and a deeper commitment to protecting not just individual victims, but the principles of human dignity and moral progress that made their civilization worth preserving. As the seasons turned and London continued its gentle evolution into an ever more sophisticated marriage of tradition and innovation, the story of the Clockwork Conspiracy became part of the city's collective memory. In workshops and laboratories throughout the metropolis, craftsmen and inventors approached their work with a deeper understanding of the moral responsibilities that came with the power to create, asking not just what could be built, but what should be built, and for what purposes human ingenuity should be directed. The fog that continued to embrace London each evening carried with it the mixed sense of coal smoke and brass polish, steam and oil and the ozone smell of electrical workshops, but also something deeper. The subtle fragrance of wisdom earned through sacrifice and determination forged in the crucible of moral complexity. It was as if the city itself had learned to breathe more thoughtfully, to dream more responsibly, and to pursue its mechanical evolution with a conscience that had been awakened by the price paid by 3 young heroes whose names would be remembered long after the details of their sacrifice had faded into legend. And in the warm sanctuary of their sitting room at Baker Street, Holmes and Watson found a peace that came not from the comfortable resolution of moral certainty, but from the harder-won satisfaction of having acted according to their best understanding of justice and duty, even when the outcome remained forever shadowed by questions that could never be fully answered. The photographs of Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Blackwood and Peter Ashford remained on their mantelpiece, not as reminders of failure or loss, but as inspiration for the continuing work of protecting the innocent and defending the principles that made their mechanical paradise worth preserving. Their bright faces and hopeful expressions served as eternal testimony to the truth that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit could find ways to choose courage over compliance, sacrifice over self-preservation, and hope over despair. Outside their windows, London's great mechanical heart continued its steady rhythm, carrying forward the dreams and aspirations of countless individuals who saw in technology not a tool for destruction, but a means of building a better world for all humanity. And in that rhythm, Holmes and Watson could hear the echo of young voices that had been silenced too soon, but whose influence would continue to shape the future in ways both seen and unseen, like the gentle ticking of a clockwork mechanism that marks the passage of time with eternal precision and grace. The story of the Clockwork Conspiracy had ended, but the principles it embodied, the importance of moral courage, the responsibility that comes with innovation, and the eternal vigilance required to protect human dignity from those who would exploit it. These lessons would continue to resonate through the generations, ensuring that the sacrifice of three young heroes would never be forgotten, and their example would continue to inspire those who face similar choices in the years to come. And so, as the fog settled over London one final time in our tale, carrying with it the promise of another day of discovery and possibility, the great city slept with the contentment of a place where justice had prevailed and human decency had triumphed over the forces of exploitation and destruction. The clockwork angels that watched over the brass and steam paradise continued their eternal vigil, guardian spirits of innovation guided by conscience and progress tempered by wisdom. Sleep well, gentle listener, and dream of a world where technology serves humanity rather than enslaving it, where the gears of progress turn in harmony with the rhythms of the heart, and where every innovation is guided by the memory of three young people who chose to give everything to ensure that their talents would serve creation rather than destruction. In the morning, may we all wake to possibilities as bright as their hopes and as enduring as their courage. But our tale does not quite end there, for in the months and years that followed, the ripples of that terrible and wonderful sacrifice continued to spread through London's mechanical society, like the gentle waves created by a stone cast into still water. The story of Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Blackwood, and Peter Ashford became more than just a memory. It became a living testament to the power of moral courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the rebuilt workshops of Whitechapel, where Edmund Hartwell continued his craft with a wisdom born of loss and a dedication deepened by memory, new apprentices learned not only the technical skills of clockwork engineering, but also the moral responsibilities that came with the power to create. Each gear that was cut, each spring that was tempered, each escapement that was adjusted carried with it the whispered reminder that innovation must always serve humanity rather than destroy it. The workshop itself had become something of a shrine to the three young people who had given their lives to protect the world from the misuse of their talents. Their workbenches remained exactly as they had left them, their tools arranged with the precision that had characterized their approach to their craft, their notebooks filled with drawings and calculations that continued to inspire new generations of artificers. But more than physical monuments, their presence lived on in the stories that Hartwell told to each new group of apprentices, tales of courage and sacrifice that transformed the act of clockwork creation into something approaching the sacred. Mrs. Pembridge, whose sharp eyes and warm heart had made her an unofficial guardian of her corner of Whitechapel, found that her tea shop had become a gathering place where young artificers came not just for refreshment, but for the stories she told about the three remarkable individuals who had once brightened her establishment with their enthusiasm and dreams. She spoke of Thomas's quick wit and innovative thinking, of Sarah's determination to prove that gender was no barrier to mechanical genius, and of Peter's quiet dedication to perfection in all things. These stories became part of the neighbourhood's oral tradition, passed from master to apprentice, from generation to generation, ensuring that their memory would never fade. The London Artificers Guild had established the Whitmore Blackwood Ashford Memorial Fund, providing scholarships and support for young people who demonstrated both exceptional technical ability and unwavering moral character. The recipients of these awards were expected not only to excel in their craft, but also to serve as guardians of the ethical principles that the three martyrs had died to protect. Each year, on the anniversary of their sacrifice, Guild members gather to renew their commitment to using their skills for the betterment of humanity rather than its destruction. Inspector Lestrade, now promoted to Chief Inspector in recognition of his role in exposing the conspiracy, had implemented new protocols throughout Scotland Yard for identifying and investigating threats that combined criminal enterprise with advanced technology. The lessons learned from the Clockwork Conspiracy had shown that the modern world's greatest dangers might come not from traditional criminals, but from those who possessed the resources and knowledge to pervert innovation for destructive purposes. These protocols had already prevented several similar conspiracies from reaching fruition, saving countless lives and preserving the trust that made London's mechanical society possible. But perhaps the most profound changes had occurred in the hearts and minds of Holmes and Watson themselves. The moral complexities they had encountered during their investigation had deepened their understanding of the responsibilities that came with their unique abilities and position in society. They continued their work as consulting detectives, but with a heightened awareness of the larger implications of their actions and a deeper commitment to protecting not just individual victims, but the principles of human dignity and moral progress that made their civilization worth preserving. Holmes had developed what he called his Whitmore Protocol, a systematic approach to investigating cases that might involve the misuse of advanced technology or the exploitation of talented individuals. This protocol required him to consider not just the immediate criminal activity, but also the broader implications of allowing such exploitation to continue unchecked. It was a more complex and demanding approach to detective work, but one that reflected the hard-won wisdom he had gained from witnessing the price that could be paid when moral considerations were subordinated to expedience. Watson, for his part, had begun writing not just accounts of their adventures, but also philosophical reflections on the moral responsibilities that came with living in an age of rapid technological change. His essays on the ethics of innovation had been published in several learned journals, contributing to a growing body of thought about how society could harness the benefits of progress while avoiding its potential pitfalls. He argued passionately that every advancement in human knowledge brought with it an equal advancement in moral responsibility, and that the memory of Thomas, Sarah, and Peter should serve as a constant reminder of this truth. The surviving apprentices from the conspiracy had all returned to their crafts, but they carried with them a profound understanding of how their skills could be perverted for evil purposes. Many had become teachers and mentors themselves, passing on not just technical knowledge but also the moral lessons they had learned through their ordeal. They spoke often of the courage displayed by their lost companions, and of the moment when those three young people had chosen to position themselves at maximum risk to ensure that their sabotage would be effective, even knowing that it would likely cost them their lives. Throughout London's mechanical districts, the story had become part of the collective consciousness of the artificer community. Young apprentices learned about the precision of Thomas's escapement work, the elegance of Sarah's gear designs, and the delicacy of Peter's timing mechanisms, but they also learned about the courage these three had shown when faced with the choice between personal safety and moral duty. The phrase, "Remember the three," had become a common greeting among artificers, a reminder that their craft carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the creation of beautiful and functional objects. The British government, shaken by the revelation that such a conspiracy could operate undetected for so long, had established new oversight bodies to monitor research and development activities that might have military applications. These organisations were tasked with ensuring that the benefits of innovation would be directed toward peaceful purposes, while preventing the sort of exploitation that had led to the Clockwork Conspiracy. The work was delicate and often controversial, requiring a careful balance between encouraging innovation and preventing its misuse, but it was guided by the principle that no advancement in human knowledge was worth the sacrifice of human dignity. As the years passed and London continued its evolution into an ever more sophisticated synthesis of tradition and progress, the memory of the Clockwork Conspiracy served as both warning and inspiration. The warning was clear, that progress without conscience was not progress at all, but merely the accumulation of power that could be turned to destructive purposes. The inspiration was equally clear, that even in the darkest circumstances human beings possessed the capacity for moral courage that could triumph over the forces of exploitation and evil. And so, as our tale truly draws to its close, We leave London breathing peacefully in the fog-softened embrace of another mechanical night, its great clockwork heart beating steadily with the rhythm of innovation guided by conscience and progress tempered by wisdom. The steam pipes carry not just heated air, but also the collective dreams of a society that has learned to value human dignity above technical achievement, and the message tubes sing not just of commerce and correspondence, but of the continuing conversation between past and future that ensures the lessons of sacrifice will never be forgotten. In workshops throughout the city, apprentices bend over their benches with tools inherited from those who came before, their hands guided not just by training, but by the memory of 3 young people who chose to give everything rather than allow their gifts to be used for destruction. Each gear they cut, each spring they temper, each mechanism they perfect carries forward the legacy of Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Blackwood and Peter Ashford, ensuring that their sacrifice will continue to inspire and protect future generations. Sleep now, gentle listener, wrapped in the warm knowledge that even in our darkest hours, the human spirit can find ways to choose light over darkness, hope over despair, and love over fear. Dream of clockwork angels watching over a city where innovation serves humanity, where progress honours the past while building the future, and where the memory of 3 young heroes continues to guide every hand that shapes metal into wonder, every mind that dreams of better tomorrows, and every heart that understands that true greatness lies not in what we can create, but in what we choose to create, and why. The night grows quiet now, and our tale drifts into memory. Tell us, are you listening from the rainy rooftops of Paris, the glowing skyline of Hong Kong, or the hushed deserts of Riyadh? If these midnight murmurs moved you, like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, sleep softly and let the shadows keep their secrets.